Welcome to your first episode of Blue Screen of Death. On this show, we'll talk anything tech. I'm your host, Klay Maggard. For our first episode, we wanted to do something big. So we decided to build our own desktop PC. And what gave us this crazy idea to do this? And how can this idea help you? Well, first of all, building your own desktop PC, it may or may not be for everyone. After you watch our video, you'll say, well, that's pretty easy. But what advantages does it offer me? Well, first, you can upgrade the internal hardware at any time you please, which actually gives you more longevity instead of going out and buying a pre-built model every couple of years. Secondly, those high-end models are pretty expensive. I know when we priced this one from Alienware or Dell or some big manufacturer, it was like 2 times the cost that we actually built with this one. Third, customization. If you're building or creating something, why not get something out of it like putting your own taste on it? And that's what we try to do today. So throughout this next episode, you'll see the computer built from scratch, and we put our own personal customization on it.
Okay, now we have our case laid out, our fans are installed, any other little cables are out of the way. We'll go ahead and install our motherboard spacers into the case. Once these are fitted nice and tight, we're ready to install our motherboard. Okay, as you can see on the table, I have our motherboard laid out. I have our heatsink that goes on our processor. I have our processor chip itself, and also a little tube of Arctic Silver thermal paste, which I really recommend as it will help drop temperatures a few degrees, and you want to protect your components. So as you can see, I removed the cover on the motherboard, pulled back the lever, opened up the socket, and now we will insert our CPU. Make sure the threads match. You don't have to force it in. It should fit nice and tight. It'll fall like right into a groove. Close the socket cover, pull the lever down, ensure that she is nice and fastened. Next thing, you want to take your CPU heatsink. It'll come stock with thermal paste on it. And what you want to do is really just take a little bit of alcohol on a paper towel and it should wipe right off. Now we'll take our Arctic Silver thermal paste and you want to apply just a little bit, no more than the size of a dime. You want to apply that right in the direct center. Because once our CPU heatsink is on, flush with the motherboard, over time it will spread that thermal paste out evenly. Now, you want to take your heatsink and Intel, it matches up with 4 pins. So once you have them lined up, you should just be able to press down on the black plastic tips and she'll pop right into place. You don't have to force it. Once you do that, turn the motherboard over, ensure that the heatsink is flush with the motherboard and all 4 white plastic pins are sticking out the other side evenly. What I like to do next is install as much into the motherboard as I can before we actually install it into the case itself. We'll go ahead and install our RAM. Notice I have it installed into the first green slot, and my next one will install into the next green slot as well. This is because the set of RAM that we actually are using are a dual channel pair. So you want to match up the colors on the motherboard to actually ensure that you're getting the dual channel performance. The RAM installs very easily. You don't have to press it down hard. Just ensure that the threads on this module are lined up with the slot on the motherboard. And she really should just click right in. You'll feel it click. It'll like fall into a groove, kind of like when we were installing our processor earlier. Now, just give them a nice little nudge. Ensure that they're flush. And if you really want to, next thing we move on to is you want to go ahead and install your motherboard plate, or more technically known as your I/O shield. So this gives the holes for your connections to the back of the computer for your keyboard, your mouse, USB, audio. Now once you have your plate securely installed, your motherboard is ready to be mounted. Alright, our next step, we want to go ahead and we will align our motherboard up with the I/O shield that we actually installed a second ago. We'll also line it up with the motherboard spacers we installed earlier. You want to ensure that these are flush and aligned so it gets a good fit with the back I/O shield and also our motherboard spacers when we go ahead and screw our motherboard in to the case. The next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and install our video card. You'll have to first remove your PCI slot covers on the back of your case. Most of the new cases are thumbless nowadays, but if they're not, just take a screwdriver, give it a little bit of hand and elbow action. Once you remove the screws, the plate should really just slide right out. Once you have removed the plates, we are ready to install our video card directly into the motherboard. And it's kind of like earlier, everything else we've been installing. The threads on the bottom of the card to match up with the slot on the motherboard. You don't have to force this one in again. Just ensure that the threads are matched up, and she really should just pop right in. You'll just feel a little click, and that's when you know that your card is installed and she has a good tight fit. What I like to handle next is we'll go ahead and take care of some of our cables. My biggest pet peeve is cable management, so I always like to have my builds looking nice and neat. First thing, we'll go ahead and install our LED wires into our motherboard, and there's usually a grid printed out on the motherboard itself for you to match up the positives and the negatives. And if it's too small for you to see, usually inside your motherboard manual you'll have one. Or if you have an Asus motherboard like myself, it actually gives you a little threads that will actually stand up from the motherboard itself, so you can go ahead, plug these into those threads, and then actually plug it into the motherboard itself, which is actually a lot nicer than having to go inside and flip wires around and having to see, not knowing what's what and if you plugged it in right or not. It saves a lot of time actually on the build. The next thing we'll do is we'll move on to our power supply. Now in this case, our power supply is actually mounted on the bottom. Some smaller ones you'll find them mounted on the top, but this one's the bottom, and it's really nice because the power supply actually pushes the hot air it produces out of the bottom of the case, which will help keep your entire ambient temperature down inside. Now you push it up nice and tight like we did with our motherboard to our I/O plate earlier. There's 4 screws. Once you get the first 2 started, the other 2 should go in easy. Just screw it in really tight, and now you're ready to actually power up your components. What we're going to do next is actually provide power to our system, and our case has provided a lot of little holes on the motherboard tray itself, and you really want to use those as much as possible, not only to keep your case looking nice and neat, but to keep the ambient temperatures down as well. You just don't want your project that you worked hard on looking like a big mess. What I want to do next is provide the main power source to our motherboard. It's a 24-pin cable actually. We'll pull it through the bottom, we'll wrap it around the side, ensuring once again that our case remains nice and neat. I've got my cable through the other side. All the threads are matched up. This time when you snap it into the motherboard, you actually will hear a click, and that's when you know that you actually secured it to the motherboard with a solid flush connection. What I'm doing next is routing the rest of the cables through the back of our case. It really is the best place to deal with cable management, and tuck all your wires away, zip tie them nice and neat so nobody has to see them. There's still a few things left we have to provide power to and connections. We'll go ahead and make the connections between our disk drives and our hard drives. They're just your standard SATA cables. The threads match up on the back of the hard drive or the disk drive, and they'll click right in. Take the other end, click it right into the slot on the motherboard. We'll provide power to our video card. As you can see now, there's a big mess of wires in front of us. It kind of really looks like a snake farm. Well, we actually have 6 fans installed in this setup, and I purposely left out a place directly below our fan controller where we can just zip tie all these wires up, roll them up, tuck them away nice and neat, and if you ever need quick and easy access to them, you can just reach in and pull them out. Now we have our wires tucked away. Everything's starting to look really clean, nice and neat. We'll go ahead and do our first power test. As you can see, We have power to the system. The heatsink fan started spinning. And what good would a custom build really be if you didn't get to put your own little taste to it or modification? We'll go through some simple instructions on how you can add your own flair and design to your case. What you want to have is there's a few standard tools that I really like to use. You need a roll of Scotch painter's tape. You also need a Dremel. A good rotary Dremel works good. And also some reinforced fiberglass rotary blades for cutting steel or other ferrous metal. If you need more of a visual aid to actually see your stencil instead of drawing it directly onto the blue painter's tape, you can take the little white piece of paper and actually will trace it through to the blue painter's tape itself, and then you can go through and do your touch-ups before you're actually ready to cut into the case. Now let me warn you before you begin, this really is a one-time shot, so any little hiccups or errors you may make, it may not be easy to fix. Now we'll start actually cutting our outline out with the Dremel. It's not too hard. It's really just straight lines, and the Dremel will actually do most of the work for you. As you can see now, our design is almost finished. The cuts are deep, and there's just a few little corners that we have to touch up before we actually can push the design out through the case. And generally, once you cut through, it'll fall out, but there's times where you might have to give it a little pop, and it'll pop right out. As you can see, we're just pushing it through the other side with our thumb, and sometimes you have to just wiggle it back and forth, and it'll eventually break off. And here you have it, folks. Nice little Holler logo cut out.
Thanks for tuning in to our first episode. On our next episode coming up, we want to talk about Apple's new iPhone 6 and how it really doesn't stand up to Android phones from the last year. And also we want to talk about a new technology that's not really so new as wireless over-the-air charging.